You're listening to Funny Peculiar with Jeff Downs.
So, welcome to another episode of Funny Peculiar Podcast. Thanks for downloading as always, and thanks for leaving all your comments. Keep them coming and we'll get more great guests on the show. This week I have an international act, and it's the wonderful Verushka Darling. And you can find Verushka, now she's a drag queen. She's based in Sydney in Australia. You can find Verushka on Instagram and Facebook, and that's Verushka spelled Verushka Darling. And for Instagram, it's a dot in the middle, so Verushka.darling. Facebook, you'll get a Verushka Darling. And on Twitter, it's at Darling Verushka, so she's flipped it about. It's a wonderful episode. We catch up with her, I think, after she'd done a show, and we were just chatting, and she tells us all about her life in Australia and the scene, which is massive out there, as we know. But anyway, it's a great interview. So without further ado, please welcome the wonderful, the fabulous Verushka Darling. So welcome to another Funny Peculiar Podcast episode, and we have our first, I'm delighted to say, international act all the way from Australia. Welcome to Verushka Darling.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be part of the podcast.
Thank you very much for joining us today, and
my pleasure.
And I hope we've just had a bit of a blast of good weather. We got blue skies out there. How's it in Sydney at the moment?
Oh, it's beautiful. We've been having kind of a very unseasonably long summer. So we've been having outrageously warm days up until just a day or two ago. So we're only now deciding to go into autumn. But I'm still in shorts and a t-shirt as we speak. So
fair enough.
Global warming.
So now Verushka Darling is your drag character. So we're going to talk about her today, and we looking on your CV here. You do so many things. We were talking earlier, I love the sound of Gender Bender Bingo. That intrigued me. There's the Stonewall Hotel as well, which sounds interesting. And we have the El Circo Rouge, like circus night or cabaret night that you MC. Indeed. So these sound fantastic. So, but let's go back, because as I ask a lot with drag, and I do character comedy, where did Verushka start? How did she come about? Where was the inspiration?
Well, it was kind of like a very organic thing, really. I mean, I'm kind of like, I suppose, very I was, especially when I was younger, very androgynous looking. I was very tall and I was very skinny and I had long hair that I could sit on, that kind of thing. And when I first started, I wasn't actually doing drag as such. I was just kind of being what they used to say back in the 90s as being, gender fucked, essentially. So I would go and
I've not heard of that one. I do.
Oh,
like
have
that.
you not? Okay, it was a big thing in Australia, in Sydney, in about the 90s. So if you were a bit androgynous and you were like, taking a bit of this and that from, each gender, then it was called being gender fucked. So it was kind of like a punk attitude towards it.
I love the honesty of the Australians. I did have a guy help us at work one day years ago, and he was Australian, and we said, what happens if it doesn't work? And he just said to us, well, it's stiff shit.
Yes,
indeed. And I think I love Barry Humphries and I love all that. So carry on. So I love that term.
So I used to basically wear mix and match of gender clothing, and was quite ambiguous looking, and a lot of the designers that I used to buy clothes from quite liked my look and what I was doing. And because I was, back then as a teenager, very young, very tall, very skinny, and I looked good in their clothes, they started getting me to model for them. So I actually started doing catwalk modeling. And when I first started, it was because I was tall and I had large feet, it was very hard to find shoes to fit, and they thought I was in look and in that particular attribute similar to the 1960s model Verushka von Lendorf. And so that's how I kind of got the Verushka part of my name. And the more catwalk I did, the bigger the names that I walked for, and then the bigger the events, and the more publicity I got. So one day I was was getting a lot of press, and a magazine came to do an interview with me about, who was this boy who's doing, women's runway. And when the journalist arrived, I introduced myself, said, "Oh, I'm Verushka Darling," meaning darling, meaning her.
Yeah.
But the journalist thought that the Darling was actually my last name, and it appeared in print, and I thought, "Oh, I like it," and it stayed.
So that's a
So
happy
that's how the
accident.
name came about.
Yeah, that's okay, right? And then what about your look? Because I do love your photos, and I follow you on Instagram, and that's
Thank you.
how I got to know you. I think Instagram's quite for the community, especially for the whole LGBT thing. It's a great unifier. I loved your outfit. You're very glam. Is this then the look, your style? Is that how do you think it came off the name? And from your ex-runway sort of career, is that where you get your style from?
Well, kind of. I mean, I have to say that I have a performance background as well, because I studied performance when I was younger. But the kind of when I first started off doing drag, Sydney was in a very kind of Sydney has always had an incredibly strong drag culture. But back in the early 90s, just after, during Priscilla and, Queen of the Desert, the movie, and just after, it was like the world hotspot for drag. And there was a lot of drag going on, but a lot of what was happening was what we call in Australia, or in Sydney in particular, production shows. And production shows are where you get three or more girls, and could be some dancers. And when I say girls, I mean drag queens, or trans people, because we've always had very mixed performance groups. And they would do highly choreographed production shows. There were routines that would, involve multiple costume changes and multiple songs, and they'd generally go for about 15 to 20 minutes. But a lot of them were what we called back then robo-drag. So the girls would look exactly alike, dress exactly alike,
Right.
and they would do incredibly, exactly matched, robotic choreography, we thought. And so my kind of take on drag is, I come from a bit of a theatrical background, so I kind of thought of the girls as being a bit voiceless because they were just miming one song after the other. So I kind of, what I did was, with my, pop culture background, was take lots of different audio samples from movies and, all sorts of different references, and I cut them into the songs, and would even record people saying things and get all of the girls in my production shows to mime each other's voices, not our own, and just created these kind of like plays or musicals, if you like. And my kind of character within those was always very proper, but my kind of ethos was that beauty had to be destroyed from within. So in order, to be really, humorous, it's always, when the very proper person comes a cropper, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
so it's kind of from that perspective. It's like, I was always the beautiful, well put together one who was, kind of a bit mad and a bit crazy. And we'd also get the oldest one in our troupe to be, always play the youngest. So there was always that kind of ironic juxtaposition going on. So that's kind of how I got where my kind of aesthetic really comes from. So although she's glamorous, she's actually a comedian and quite funny. So that's
And
kind of where I'm at.
And that was interesting you were saying about Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, because very much in the film, and it's interesting that robo-drag, there are the three robotic characters on stage. So that was very much a foundation of the whole Sydney scene back then in the early 90s.
It was very much a feature. I wouldn't say a foundation, because Sydney went through sort of different eras in drag. So, I mean, in the 60s, really, the big influence were Les Girls, which was a transgender showgirl kind of thing. So it was your classic tits and feathers kind of shows, and they were amazing. And then after that, there was kind of like a bit of almost a punk reflex or reaction to it, where the girls were just crazy. They would just have piles of clothing, they would just put them on and, just do mental kind of shows. And again, a bit gender fucked. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, and then into the 90s, it became a lot more professional. And the girls were, all professional performers, and they did highly choreographed, highly rehearsed, very tight and quite spectacular and glamorous kind of shows. But they became very, very, like I said, I say robo, but I don't mean that in a derogatory term. It was just that was kind of the format. The girls looked alike, they dressed alike, they danced alike. And sometimes it was a bit hard to tell which performer was which.
And I think to a lot of people, especially for me, living in the UK, Australia is basically, when it comes to drag, obviously there's a massive scene now. There's Pride, it's huge, but it was like early on, 60s was Barry Humphries would probably be the only one you would name. So I didn't know there was an actual drag scene going back to the 60s in Sydney.
Oh, even before.
Wow.
Yes, it's drag has always been a cornerstone of the gay and lesbian community in Sydney. And in the very early days, when we were still illegal and we were still underground, the drag performers were the ones keeping the community together and bringing the community together. So, we've always been a really important part of the Sydney community. It's quite different, from the scene in London. Not saying that drag is not important in London, of course, but the scene that we have is really very different, including the way we perform. In London, for example, you get the club kid kind of drag, so they look spectacular and they're great, visual garnish in a nightclub, and they create visual excitement. But then you also get, the singing drag queen, doing a solo show at, a pub, down the road.
Yeah.
Whereas for us, there's been that element of both of those, but we've also had the big production shows. So we do dance party shows, we do nightclub shows, and it's all, kind of like all miming, all dancing, all, costuming kind of productions. And they've been really ingrained. So if ever there's an event, there's a drag queen hosting it. If ever there's a party, there are drag shows, as the highlight of the performance. If there's ever a political movement, then the drag queens are up front and center. So drag in Sydney is, like I said, it's a real cornerstone of the gay and lesbian community.
And would you say with Sydney that it would in other cities in Australia? So is it big in Melbourne, in Perth, or is it just tends to be in Sydney?
No. It's big all over Australia, but Sydney is kind of like the epicenter. Because even though we're not the capital of Australia, we kind of are. And I know that there'd be girls in other capitals like Melbourne where we are like, well, I don't know about that. But really, the scene is a bit bigger here.
Yeah. And it's so obviously massive drag now. And every city does in a different way in every country.
Yes.
And RuPaul, the drag race, has been phenomenally successful in America. Would you say there was any room for it in Australia? Do you think there would be a show like that? Or because it's just such a vast industry anyway, it probably wouldn't need it in Australia?
Well, we don't need it as such in Australia. It's a phenomenon here, I have to say. It's really had an impact on drag in Australia because we have a really distinct drag culture. And it's and kind of like almost like a career path when you come through drag, of how you start, what you do, where you go. And we have our own language and the way we speak and the things that we say and the things that we do. And it's really interesting because the young kids coming through don't have that connection. So their connection to drag is what they see on RuPaul's Drag Race.
Yeah.
So, they come out to us and they're all like, yas, mama, slay, sister, fierce, fierce, fierce.
Yeah.
And to us, that's totally anathema. It's
Right.
like, that's not how we speak and that's not how we do things, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But at the same time, all Australians seem to, well, gay and lesbian Australians, watch it. So it's an interesting influence. I kind of wish that the younger kids actually got to know their own, even though they're out, watching it.
Yes.
I wish they actually got to know their own culture as well as they got to know the television culture.
Well, it sounds amazing heritage that you have over here, and I didn't know that about how far it went back. But so you yourself are, and I see a lot of pictures. You are very much an MC. That you host a lot of events, and and I'm intrigued to know about this El Circo, which is this big cabaret night. So can you just tell us about that and your role in that and the different acts that you have on?
Sure. Well, El Circo was actually created by a friend of mine, and it was actually created for me, which is quite flattering.
Oh,
So it was. I have a creative partner, a fellow drag queen. She's French, but she's an Australian citizen,
yeah.
and her name is Claire de Lune. And she and I did a lot of television. So I used to be an MTV VJ for
Ah,
many
right.
years. And she
Okay.
used to be on the kind of like the rival channel. So she was on Channel V. But we've been working together since, well, since I was a teenager, essentially. So 3 or 4 years now. But we've always done, we've produced, big dance parties here in Australia, and we've produced production shows. And she was looking for something to do because she's also is a French chef and runs a very famous French restaurant. And she was looking for something a bit different to kind of combine, the food aspect and performance. And we've done some things, or she had done some things which I'd worked at before, which were kind of like dinner parties, and they were surrealist parties where strange performances would happen, and the food was kind of like a bit of the performance. And when she moved to a venue called Slide and became the general manager there, she thought, well, this would be a perfect opportunity to create something for this venue. And so what eventually came to be is this kind of like 9-course degustation where the food is kind of a bit of the performance, but with 9 circus and burlesque acts that happen around it. And I'm the face of it, and I'm the MC, but I'm also one of the performers. And we've been going for about almost 11 years now, and we've been sold out every night for at
Wow.
least the last 9.
Oh my lord.
And so we're kind of like a bit of a fixture in the Sydney, and also I was not so much the drag scene, but in the Sydney performance, and especially the circus performance scene. And our performers are actually really amazing. And I say that, and it may sound like I'm biased because I work there, but I actually, they are amazing because to give you an idea, when Cirque du Soleil come in town, they book us out for a private viewing.
Oh,
So,
well,
so
that
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 kind of gives you an idea.
wow. And these are all Australian circus performers as well, or for
Some
international?
of them are international
Yeah.
because we've got a bit of a circus family. So some of our performers go out and work in other circuses. So they work in Cirque du Soleil, and they work in Le Grand Cirque, and they work, in Canada and in Europe. And then, some of them come back, and some of them work in other circuses here as well. And so we kind of have this very large performing family that we draw on. And every now and then they'll bring in, people they've collaborated with, and if we love them and they, fit in well with our family, then they join us as well. And
And
it's
these
been
are sorry, are these acrobats, jugglers? What
it's
sort of?
everything. So we have contortionists, we have aerialists, we have
Oh,
trapeze artists, we have lyra artists, we have straps, we have silks, we have floor workers, we have jugglers, we have clowns, we have everything.
sorry, I've not straps and silks. That's a new one for me on terminology. So,
Okay. So silks are, if you can imagine, they're an aerial performance. So you have
ah,
2 very long pieces of fabric,
yes, I would
and
yeah, that's what they're
and
called.
they're generally silk, because the
Ah,
silk has a very good, strength to it,
I didn't.
essentially.
Okay,
And so they, do acts, where they tie themselves up in the silks, and they do drops and falls and tumbles and splits and things. And then straps are kind of, it's kind of like a cross between Roman rings and silks. So they
okay.
have handles at the end, but um, the performer kind of goes about working on them as if they were like a Roman ring. So they kind of pull themselves up into cross lifts, but they will also, tumble and twist and contort with whilst using the straps. I don't know if that gives you a clear idea,
Yeah.
but if you can imagine what happens on silks, kind of cross with Roman rings, except there are no rings, then that's kind of what straps are.
Fantastic. Oh, it sounds such a varied and eclectic sort of acts that you have on. Now
Oh no, it's
yourself,
great. And it's like you never know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
You could come twice and see the same things, or
Same.
come twice and never see the same things.
And so you're hosting as well, but you say you do an act as well. So is that your drag act, your Verushka Darling?
Yeah, so I'll do a performance, generally at the end, not necessarily, but it has become that. So normally at the end, what happens is that at the end of the night, people get very excited and they want to get up and dance, and we have this big light up dance floor. So I generally close the night with a big dance number. So it's like a grand finale dance number.
Wow.
So there'll normally be an aerial act, and then straight after the aerial act, I come on. And then after that, I, do the big thank yous and goodbyes, and then bring the audience up onto the stage.
And how do you keep your act fresh? Are you looking for new dance routines all the time? Are you looking for new looks? How do you
because everything that I do is really varied. So I work multiple nights of the week, and I do multiple things. So it's kind of like I never really get bored. So, and all of the audiences are quite different. And if I'm doing what we call spot numbers, which are solo numbers, then yes, I look for different things to do. And, I generally look for humorous numbers, although I do everything from, talk songs to dance numbers to comedy numbers. But I also do a stand-up comedy show, and I do, like you said, the gender bender bingo, and I do, all sorts of things. So it's like, variety is the spice of life.
Well, and so you do stand-up comedy, wonderful. And is there a little bit on YouTube that if someone wanted to go look, we could find you on there?
Possibly. My stand-up comedy is it's an interesting conceit. What I do is I do a show that's been running probably for about 10 years or more as well at Stonewall Hotel.
Okay.
And it's a show called Let's Talk About Sex. And it's the conceit is that I'm there to help people with their problems. So there's a letterbox on stage, and people write to me with their problems.
Okay.
And then at 8:30, what I do is I take to the stage and I solve, and I say solve in inverted commas, and I solve their problems live on stage.
Okay.
And it's basically just me making, a comedy show out of their problems.
And what sort of problems have you had? Have you had sort of
they're all ridiculous. They're all I mean, some of them are very serious, and if they do make, ask me serious problems, and I just, make it, humorously obvious that they've probably come to the wrong place. But anything, as I said at the beginning, it could be a sexual problem, it could be a psychological problem, it could be a fashion problem, it could even be a geopolitical problem.
Right.
And it's quite funny because I do bring a lot of politics into it, and I actually get a lot of people from the various political parties come and watch my show. And in fact, I get a lot of people from the Conservative government that we have called the Liberal Party, and I'm not conservative, and I often rip into the Liberals, and they just love it, and they come and watch it, and they come enjoy being, sent up.
Yes, because it's quite a history of politicians in Australia, and so it's Conservative government at the moment, and there was a big rock star, wasn't there? Peter Garrett from Midnight Oil. He wandered into the world of politics, didn't he?
Well, that's a good memory. Yes, that was probably back in the 1980s, and he was kind of in a nuclear disarmament party until he realised that maybe the party had been hijacked by, socialist interests, you know what I mean? And then he tried to join the Labour Party, and the Labour Party got him on board for environmental reasons, and because he was rock star. But as soon as he got in there, they basically, shoved him to the side, and he left.
He got a bit chewed up and spat out, I think.
Yes, indeed. It was quite cynical.
So you have the government's ear. That's incredible. So it's like
some of them.
Some of them. So this is this is at the Stonewall Hotel. So so you do emceeing and shows there as well.
Yes, I do.
And also we're looking, and I want to talk about your look as well, because it is just so glamorous. You're so gorgeous.
Oh, thank you. You're very kind.
And where do you get your? You must have a designer, obviously, or you have your hair. And where does that all come about? Do you have people in the back helping you out? And
oh, absolutely, and not even in the back, in the front, and on the sides, and from all directions. No, I'm very lucky because, it really does take a village, as they say. And I've got a very talented friend. So I have my designer, my dress designer, is a very talented person who he actually studied costume over in London at the in one of the museums, and basically was doing restoration and kind of learned costume making kind of like through restoration. He does a lot of costumes for events and like major events over here. And I've known him since the the 90s, and we're very good friends. And he is very generous and makes my costumes for me. And the person who does my hair is a drag queen, a famous drag queen in Australia called called Vanity Fair.
Oh, right.
And she has a company called Wigs by Vanity, who
Yes.
you may or may not know, or your listeners may or may not know, via Courtney Act, because
Yes.
Courtney's involved in that. And Vanity is kind of like, I would probably be, it would probably be politic to say drag sister, but she's actually Courtney's kind of like drag mother and creator.
Okay.
And
I think-
Vanity is an amazing, hairstylist.
Yes.
And it's her wig business, essentially. So Vanity does my hair for me. So I'm very lucky in that regard. And when it comes to makeup, I'm all self-taught.
That's all. I was going to say it's wonderful as well how you apply. After the interview, I will ask you about eyebrow technique because
Sure, no problem.
it's one of the, and of course you get obviously now with the internet, YouTube. There's a million tutorials out there by.
Yes.
So do you get into that? You're too busy because you're how many days a week are you actually performing? How many shows do you do a week?
Well, I mean, it's really hard to say because I do. It's like I work most nights of the week, but the number of shows that I do really varies. So I have what I call my regular gigs, and then I have corporate gigs, and then I have private parties, and so it all really it's mixed. But I'm pretty busy most nights of the week. But with the drag career, it's like even if you're not working actually on stage, generally you're working at it.
Yes.
So, for example, tomorrow will be my one day off in the past fortnight, and I will be going to my costume designers, and I will be getting some more costumes.
Wow, it's non-stop. It's not, and also I want to ask you about and I love the idea of the tranny bingo caller at Gender Bender Bingo.
Yes.
So how long have you been doing that for?
I've been oh God, I don't know, years. I don't know how many, but I've been doing it for years. Yeah, and the show, it used to be called Tranny Bingo, but it's now called Gender Bender Bingo.
Right.
So that's how those two.
And it's actually bingo that you're doing, to ask a stupid question.
Yeah, well, yes, it's kind of, well, yes, it is, but it's very, it's a bit more involved the way we do it. So it's very comedic. So a lot of our calls for numbers have stories and jokes and other things involved with them. But we also do performances to break up the actual games of bingo.
Sure.
You'll see shows and shows and bingos.
Could you give us some of your number calls? I'm intrigued because it's big. Bingo's obviously massive in the UK. Legs 11, Maggie's Den number 10.
Oh, it's kind of, it's hard to say. It's like, oh God, let me see. I don't know. Some of them are really quite long, so it might be boring to hear them. So it's not, Legs 11, of course, is universal, but we'll have, oh goodness, let me see. Oh yes, for example, 88, we'll say, two fat drag queens with tight belts, walking hand in hand in the Chubby Chasers float at the Mardi Gras parade, and we might talk about what they're doing in the parade, what they might be eating to make themselves fat. Or that.
Right. I love the idea of that. That's fantastic. And finally, and listen, it's been wonderful chatting. And my last question, if I can, and I'm always asking, and listen, we'll probably in how many months down the line we'll come back, and if possible, I'd love to have you back on the show if that's possible.
Oh, I'd love to.
I think I've only touched the tip of the iceberg with the amount of your career.
Look at you touching my tip. How rude. think if you're only going to touch the tip, then you have to come back.
I have to, yes. I know. From this distance as well. What a reach I have. I know. I am very tall. So, who would you recommend I interview next, or to come on the show for the Funny Peculiar podcast? Who do you think I should chat to?
If it was Australian, then I think there were, if you wanted to do drag queens, then really I would say, Claire de Lune is actually quite fascinating. So my French, chef sister girlfriend.
Yeah.
She was just covered recently by 60 Minutes in France, actually, did a big interview with her. And then there's a very famous performer who called Trevor Ashley. I don't know if you've ever heard of Trevor Ashley. Trevor Ashley started off as a kind of a cabaret performer, but then when his career wasn't doing, terribly well, he segued into drag and then took off. And then he's now a very big musical theatre star. So he produces his own musical shows, but he also plays in, so for example, he's played the mother in Hairspray, he's played the innkeeper in Les Miserables, and one of the characters in the Priscilla Queen of the Desert, the musical, was actually made specifically for him. So they created for him, and now it's become part of the repertoire in the musical. So he's great to interview. He's very funny. And maybe if you're interested in, people like Vanity would have a very interesting story, I'm sure.
I'm sure I will try and get in touch with Vanity. Listen, thank you very much for giving us your time today.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thank you for being interested.
It's been wonderful speaking to you, and thank you. And also, very quickly, where can we see you for any international people listening podcast? Where can we see you next? Where are you performing at the moment?
Well, at the moment, I don't have any international gigs at the moment, although I do that as well. But at the moment, so Mondays I tend to work in doing Gender Bender Bingo in Newtown, which is a suburb in Sydney. Wednesday this week I will be performing in Balmain. Thursday I will be performing on Oxford Street. And then Friday I will be doing 2 gigs. I do my comedy routine, and then I do a late night show with the production shows at Stonewall. And then Saturday I will be performing in El Circo.
Wonderful. And social media, so you're on Instagram, and that's Verushka Darling. You can be seen on Instagram.
Absolutely.
Facebook as well, that's right, isn't
it? Indeed. And
Twitter? Have you got?
No, I don't do Twitter. I don't like Twitter.
Yes, I think everybody's going off Twitter. I think Instagram seems to be the big one, but
yes.
But anyway, thank you very much again for coming on the show today, Verushka Darling.
You're welcome. I hope your listeners were interested in that. I was able to tell an interesting story.
You were indeed. Thank you very much again.
You've been listening to Funny Peculiar. Tune in next week. More great guests.
So a big thank you to Verushka Darling for coming on the show. She was wonderful, and some really interesting stuff about the drag scene in Sydney. Just to give you a reminder, you can follow her on Instagram and Facebook. She did say she doesn't really have a Twitter account. She has got one there, but she doesn't really use it. So I say follow her on Facebook or Instagram, send her a message, say hello. She's absolutely delightful. So again, it's Verushka, which is VERUSHKA.Darling, and you can get her on Instagram or Facebook. Again, I'll put this all in the bio, and it'll be on the website. So thank you again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that one. More great guests coming up, and keep it funny peculiar.